Let me ask you a question this morning. Are you seeking whatever is noble? Just turn for a moment. We're going to be looking in a moment at Job chapter 39, where we read a little earlier. But just as a lens through which to look at Job 39, let's turn to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8 for a moment. And I want to extract just one little phrase from that passage. You will find that it varies in translation depending on whether you are reading the English Standard Version or the Authorized Version, or as I shall read from the New King James. But I draw your attention to this. There is, of course, whenever a preacher says finally, there is a caution implicit, because rarely when a preacher says finally does he actually mean he's drawing to a close. However, Paul at this point, writing to the Philippians, tells us finally, brethren. And he tells them that they are to have their thinking, their meditation, their thoughts filled with certain things, certain qualities. Whatever things are true. And this is the phrase that I want to draw to your attention this morning. The second phrase, whatever things are noble. And I want to ask you to consider, am I seeking to fill my thoughts with what is noble this morning? What does it mean to be noble? We have a branch of our what we term the nobility, the higher class, the status, those who are in some way of royal preference and appointment. But this has nothing to do with that. It is to do with moral qualities of nobility. And I would suggest it is probably easier to recognize nobility than it is to define it. Just think for a moment of two very sad incidents that happened in our country, or at least to citizens of our country, over the past couple of weeks. In the Midlands, there is a city called Nottingham. At one point I used to work in Nottingham and also in Derby, and would travel there on a daily basis from Leicester. And a couple of weeks ago there was a sudden news broadcast, and news was filled with certain of the names of the roads in Nottingham, some of which I recognise, some of which I used to drive along. And two students, first of all, had been walking home late into the early hours, admittedly. At the end of their first year, they had been commemorating, marking the end of their first year of studies. They had their lives ahead of them. They were both, as far as I understand, successful in their studies. They were walking home and suddenly are the victims of a violent attack. And their lives are extinguished in a few moments. We would say, humanly speaking, what a waste. We would say, humanly speaking, what a tragedy. We would say, humanly speaking, how unfair. They had everything to live for. And then, just these last few days, we have a father and son. We understand that the son was in some trepidation over the exercise that would be a father and son bonding exercise. That they would be together over the weekend of what was termed Father's Day. Now you would say normally, well, that was a noble thing for father and son to be together, to be embracing one another's company, to be enjoying one another's company. And a lot of money was paid, seemingly, for a particular trip. And then, in an instant, in a moment, that whole thing turns upon its head. And it is all to no avail. And the families are mourning, and the families are grieving, and the families are heartbroken. Whatever things are noble, that is our challenge this morning. Turn back with me, if you will, to the book of Job, to Job chapter 39. We need to read this chapter with chapter 38 also, because there, the beginning of the Lord's answer to Job out of the whirlwind. And just to briefly summarize, in that earlier chapter, chapter 38, and through most of that chapter, God is concerned with telling Job of his providence, his governance of the natural creation, as we would see it, of the universe, of even the planet on which we live, of the weather, and of the stars in their places. He is, if you will, concerned with the inanimate creation. And his governance upon the inanimate creation is absolute. He governs whether it be the fall of rain or whether it be the stars in their course. He governs whether it be the light that comes or whether it be the sea that would encroach. He governs in all these things. God rules absolutely. The Bible sets before us a God who rules in all the details of the inanimate creation round and about us. Then, from verse 39, we are introduced to those members of the animal kingdom which are not domesticated animals. They are wild animals. And God's providence extends to those wild animals. God's providence extends to those animals which even we can barely reach, barely see, barely know. There are many animals even within this country that we rarely see. The BBC and others put on programmes often that show us some of these environments. They're very hard for many people to get to know. It's fascinating to see. But here God is outlining that these wild animals, they are under his providential control, his providential care, that the provision that is made for them is in his providence, that what they do is in his providence, and God is ruling in these matters. And so we have, through this Job 38:39 through to Job 39:18, we have an emphasis upon those animals that are not domesticated. And in 2 or 3 places we have the stress upon the fact that it is the wild animal. Sometimes that isn't necessary, it's obvious. So in verse 39 we're not told, can you hunt the prey for the wild lion? Everybody knows that a lion is wild. When you read, verse 1 of chapter 39, do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Well, there are domesticated goats. So we're told here, we're not concerned with the domesticated, we're here concerned with the wild goats. Do you mark when the deer gives birth? Mostly wild. Verse 5, who set the wild donkey free? Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? And then the ostrich. Well, we have, of course, ostrich farms, but normally speaking, wild. All those creatures under the providence of God in the provision that is made for them, under the providence of God in the governance of their lives. If a lion attacks, think of that instance. David Livingstone, significant anniversary this year for David Livingstone. But a lion so severely mauled his shoulder that when his body is taken home, taken to the coast of Africa by those who loved him and cared for him, those who were with him in his final expedition, the way in which his body was recognized after they carried him through many miles of Africa. His body is recognized by the deformation of his shoulder because of the paw of the lion that has come upon it. The providence of God governs even in that. But there are those who struggle with the idea of God's absolute providence, God's absolute rule, God's absolute watchfulness and control over every detail of our lives and every detail of the lives of those around us and every detail of the lives of the animals around us and every detail of the universe in which we live. And they say, well, it is one thing to believe in the providence of God with regard to the stars in their courses, with regard to the planets, with regard to the universe. It is one thing to believe in the providence of God with regard to that. It is another thing to regard the providence of God with regard to the animal kingdom, in the wild. But you cannot believe in the providence of God with regard to human beings. Because human beings, they say, have free will. That's what they love to say. And therefore, God has left human beings to make their free choices and to choose for themselves as they will do. And therefore, God's providence cannot be said to operate in that realm. Well, you see, from verse 19 to verse 25 of Job chapter 39, it is abundantly plain not only that domestic animals are under the providence and control of God and the providential care of God, but also that the human beings who are involved with those domestic animals are also, in every detail and circumstance of their lives, under the control and watchful eye and the providential care of God. Because God doesn't choose in verse 19 and onwards here to simply tell us of a horse in its domestic setting. He chooses to tell us of a horse in the context and setting of warfare. You know, if you go back 150 years or so, you find that London, its streets, generally moved at approximately the same speed as traffic does now. The difference being that it was then horse-drawn. Now it is driven increasingly by electric vehicles, but the speed is similar. And there were numerous horses in London in 1880 and onwards. And they were, of course, domestic. Whether it be the brewery drays or those who were the rag and bone men a little later, they are engaged in domestic work with human supervision. But from verse 19 through verse 25 here, God is concerned to show us the horse not in a merely domestic vein, but in a military vein also. And firstly, I want to observe that there is, as I suggested in introducing this with Philippians 4 verse 8, there can be something noble in a military conflict and a military cause. It doesn't mean that there are never things that are ignoble. It doesn't mean that there are never things that are questionable. But there can at least be something noble in a military campaign. And it is interesting that God, as he speaks to Job here, should choose to speak not of the horse in its domestic role, but in its military role. And God, perhaps just a few hundred years, if that, after the flood, is telling Job of this animal and the nobility of this animal and the zeal of this animal and of course this animal under human control. So as we read of the horse, we read also implicitly of the rider who is controlling the horse, who is also under the control of God with regard to the providence of God. Now this is remarkable. Generally speaking, it is the hope of those who manufacture weapons that those weapons will never be used. There used to be an understanding of what was called mutually assured destruction. That if you had a nuclear weapon, the fact that your opponent could deliver a nuclear weapon and destroy your civilization, just as you would deliver your nuclear weapons and destroy his, because the destruction were mutually assured, no rational person would engage in nuclear conflict. That, of course, begs the question of an absolute leader, a dictator, who might be in terrible ill health, might be given days to live, as to whether they then would apply that rationale, whether that rationale would still apply. But mutually assured destruction meant that when you built a nuclear weapon, when the scientists and mathematicians, the physics experts, the engineers, when they're involved, their intent is that these weapons will never be used. But it is interesting that just as in a similar vein, God here is teaching Job, and he tells Job of the conflict that has entered the world because of sin. There can be something noble about conflict. There can be something noble about military endeavour. But the reason for conflict, the reason for the need for military endeavour, the reason for the existence of armed forces is because of not the creation of man, but the fall of man. Because we are, though made in the image of God, we are fallen. And therefore conflict and strife has entered the world. It entered the world in the first family, as Cain and Abel. The first two sons born to Adam and Eve, and Abel is murdered by Cain. On a small scale, we see what will begin to unfold into the conflicts we have between families, between tribes, between nations. And it is all because of sin. And yet God has built into human society that resilience. It's a remarkable indication of the common grace of God, that he provides in common grace for those things that are necessary. A police force, armed forces. He gives us these things. And we can be thankful for them. When the Roman soldiers would come to John the Baptist, they weren't told that they should give up their place in the Roman legions. They should give up their place in the Roman army. They are simply told to do what is right within that army. And God here, first and foremost, he is showing Job his providence extends even to the most extreme circumstance, even the most extreme situation on the battlefield, brought about only by sin. However noble a particular cause might be, always having the ignobility attached to it of excess strife and violence that goes too far. But God is teaching Job, and he's teaching Job that even this creature, the war horse, is to be restrained, is to be under control. And it's under control of a human being, but supremely it is under the control of God. And I ask you the question this morning, are you conscious that your life in its every aspect is under the control of God, is under the watchful eye of God, that control of God in providence extends particularly to the lives of believers, and even circumstances and situations when believers backslide, God in love is still watching over, God in love is still overruling, God in love is still designing. Just think for a moment of that unbeliever who was amongst the 12, that unbeliever who, as it were, through his time with the Lord Jesus Christ was characterized as being a thief. He was the one who would always be remembered on that whenever we gather at the Lord's table, because we are reminded that it was on the night that he was betrayed that Jesus took bread. And so, without being named, that one is always, we're always reminded of him. And he was prepared to sell the Lord Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And you will say, well, where is God? But you see, Judas 100% responsible for what he did. Judas 100% responsible for that betrayal of Christ. But at the same time, according to the predeterminate counsel and foreknowledge of God, God overrules. God weaves Judas' action into his plan, into his perfect design. The action that Judas intends to be a betrayal, perhaps, we don't know, to provoke the Lord Jesus to declare his kingdom, to act in power. Perhaps that may lay behind it, we don't know. But God is weaving what Judas does in that terrible act of betrayal. He's weaving it into his plan and purpose that he will save his people. And if he does that with Judas, how much more will he do that in any lesser matter, in any lesser concern? And God is teaching Job through the war horse, through the battle. He's teaching Job that his providence extends to every detail of his life. Job has despaired of life. Job knows that his life is almost forfeit. He's suffering this terrible skin disease. He's suffering this terrible illness. His breath is foul. So many aspects of the illness described. And yet God is in control. And he's in control of every detail of life. And friends, it has been put like this, that if there were any place that were better for a believer to be, then God's love would have put them there. But you are where you are because God in love sees it to be the very best place for you. And God, through his declaration concerning the natural world, concerning the animal kingdom, concerning the domesticated, even the domesticated in military service, he is demonstrating his control, his rule. The hymn writer puts it, sovereign ruler of the skies. And then he tells us not a single shaft can hit till the God of love sees fit. You know, sometimes we're fearful. We become afraid. And that's why so often the Old Testament tells us, fear not. Sometimes we become afraid, and that's why so often the Lord Jesus Christ tells his disciples, fear not. Friends, are you seeking what is noble this morning? Or have you despaired? Have the things that seem so futile about life so futile about the way in which things are unfolding? Have they made you despair? Because we do not despair, because God is still upon the throne. God still rules in the affairs of man. And God is going to conclude the 39th chapter with telling us of yet another wild creature, the hawk. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings to the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high? Well, you see, he's still summarizing the battle. Because in the 30th verse, its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. It isn't just that the hawk is an afterthought in this passage, an afterthought in this chapter. It's there for logical reasons. We're talking of the battlefield where the horse has done its duty, where the horse has done its role, filled its role as an instrument of war. And from that battlefield there will be all sorts of creatures that will benefit. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom? Does the eagle mount up at your command? God, in a most strange way, is making provision in providence for these creatures. And therefore, where the slain are, there it is. God is ruling, even over nature red in tooth and claw. God rules, not just in the affairs of men, but in all that unfolds. Let's turn in our hymn books to 239. We sing of the glory of Christ. Thine be the glory, risen, conquering